Matthew uses the Greek word ecclesia, which means church, in only 2 places. One of them occurs in our gospel today. He concludes the passage about Christian community with one of my favorite lines in the Bible. Jesus says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them." Now, to most people in our culture, this is not at all intuitively obvious. Outside the church, people describe faith as a private affair. It is something that happens to you when you're by yourself on a mountaintop in the Sierras, or alone on a tropical beach or at a woodland lake. Jesus tells the disciples that life in Christ happens in community, even if it is only a community of 2. Perhaps this is another way of saying that we need each other, not just practically, but spiritually also. He knows that we'll be smarter and stronger together than apart, that only together will we have a chance to accomplish anything truly great. He reminds us that we need each other the way that brothers and sisters do. We, as Jesus' disciples, belong to one family. Now, last month, our adult children moved home to live with us. Oh, and it is such a joy. Everybody can see it. They're just like, do you have a suntan? Have you lost weight? No, I just have both the children living with us. And it reminds me that when families work well, they become a way that God teaches us important lessons, like how to share and cooperate. And sharing and cooperating are not easy. I mean, as someone who rides my bike here every Sunday, as I go through the intersections, that's the one part of the streets where we have to share, right? And every time some car is jockeying with some bicycle, I think to myself, well, sharing is difficult, isn't it? So that's one of the lessons we learn from families. And Jesus reminds us that we learn many other things too. We learn how to take care of someone whose needs might be totally different than our own. Family life smooths out the rough edges of our character. We learn that we can't always have everything our own way. We give up what we want so that someone else can have what they want. Now, living with others teaches us to negotiate and to compromise, to figure out together what's best for the group. And while this is not always pleasant, I believe it is a way that we become more perfectly human. It can take a long time to figure out what your family has to teach you. And fortunately, families don't just teach us how to fight, they also teach us how to forgive one another too. But not everyone grew up in families that worked well, because some just simply don't. These families do not teach forgiveness and cooperation. Often in them, rules are more important than people, and the first rule is silence about anything that will make waves. They say, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. And some families use this rule to enforce a kind of false harmony. They use it to mean that if you have a problem with someone, you keep it to yourself, because the illusion of getting along is more important than anything else. This illusion is more important than the truth, more important than your feelings, even more important than you are. Now, it's sad, but many families teach this lesson. Jesus' point this morning is that the Christian family does not work like this. Jesus says that if your brother sins against you, you have to go back and talk to him. And if this doesn't work, you must keep going to them with others and do everything that you can to help him to be your brother again. Now, 2 things stand out about this advice for me. The first is that Jesus puts the burden of reconciliation on the victim, on the person who was sinned against. Now, this is not advice that holds in extreme situations, certainly not when there's a case of abuse. But for more ordinary situations, like the ones we encounter most frequently, it encourages us to cultivate a kind of openness to another person. Second, Jesus seems less interested in who is right than in getting the family back together again. What seems to matter most to him is that members of his family really listen to each other. If a family member refuses to listen, we do everything we can do to keep the doors of communication open. Jesus insists that we do not simply pretend that nothing has happened. He wants us to recognize when someone has left our family, because the only thing worse than losing a sister or brother is losing that person and yet still having them around. Now, all of us can see the wisdom of this advice. In theory, we know that this is what we should do, but in practice, we think of 1,000 excuses to not do this. So I want you to imagine, I was thinking of so many different examples I could use from our cathedral life, but I didn't want anybody to feel embarrassed, especially not me. And so I'm using an example from the preacher Barbara Brown Taylor, who I got most of the sermon from anyway. And I've adjusted this story to make it fit our circumstances, or at least to fit my circumstances. Imagine sitting in church every week and getting to know the person next to you. And let's say his name is Duke, and the two of you also share an interest in surfing. One September morning, Duke asks to borrow your surfboard, and you won't be using it, and it feels so good to lend a Christian brother something that gives you both so much joy. But then next week, the surf builds up, the waves start building, and you want your surfboard back. And Duke's not returning your phone calls, and finally you get through to him, and he tells you that he lent your surfboard to somebody else. And not only that, but that person damaged the board, and it's not just like a little ding. He tells you that it was such bad luck, but your board broke in half. It's unusable and will never be repaired. Now, this doesn't seem fair to you, so you go over to talk to him, and you say, because you're friends, you're willing to pay half of the full cost of replacing the board. And Duke gets angry and tells you that it wasn't his fault, that the other guy broke the board, and that you should be a better sport about it. So you go back home, and you notice two other people from your congregation, and you choose two of those congregants from here at Grace Cathedral to go with you and go back. And this time, Duke is really mad. He accuses you of ganging up on him and embarrassing him in front of others. He yells at you to get off his property and before he calls the police. So imagine sending out an email to everyone in the cathedral congregation, asking them to meet in front of Duke's house on Saturday afternoon. Since you know he won't open the door, you make little signs that say, "Forget about the surfboard, Duke," or "Let's talk." And on Saturday, everyone gathers there, and the house is locked up tightly, and you see the drapes kind of pulled back. You can't really see him inside, but you wave and you kind of beckon him to come outside. You know Duke is watching. And then, 20 minutes later, Duke comes out of his house, and he hands you a check for the broken surfboard. Now, I know what you're thinking over there in the congregation. You're thinking, I'm sure tired of all these stories about surfing all the time. Or perhaps you're even more likely to be saying to yourself, that wouldn't work. But my point is, how do you know? Have you ever tried anything quite like this? Now, usually when I get wronged by somebody, my strategy differs substantially from what Jesus recommends. The first thing I want to do is to pretend like nothing happened. I'll forget that old surfboard anyway. I'll just let it go and try not to be upset. But the awkwardness that I feel around Duke is going to not go away. And I try to ignore it even though I can't. Now, the second strategy is familiar to us also, and that's the cold shoulder approach. You don't tell the person what's bothering you because that would be impolite, but you show it by treating them as if they weren't there. It doesn't occur to you to ask them what happened between the two of you, because you assume that you already know. Now, the third strategy, I'll call that the revenge strategy. Most of us wouldn't call it that, because we're Christians. But it amounts to pretty much the same thing. We have such bad feelings in our heart that we do our best to turn other people against the one who hurt us. We tell jokes at their expense, hoping that it'll make us feel better. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, he describes hell as a vast, abandoned city, a kind of urban sprawl that stretches out and out. The people there have intractable conflicts with each other, and they simply move further and further away from each other. So they do that, so that they're almost totally on their own. So that's the reason that C.S. Lewis says that hell is always growing. It's growing because people don't want to be near each other, so they keep moving further and further away from the center. In other words, they choose to have distance rather than confrontation. Distance rather than confrontation. Sounds a little bit familiar to me. Jesus, though, instructs us to do the opposite of this, to choose closeness even though it means confrontation. And so we have 1,000 excuses to avoid confrontation. We say, oh, she's the one who did something wrong, or he let me, let her come to me, or it wouldn't make any difference anyway. And so things never change. And the excuses, they're totally fine if you want to stay in your own little suburban hell, but they're not acceptable for those of us who are called to Christian community. For Christians, there's something more important than being right or wrong, and that is being a family together. Our real problem is not the wrong that someone has done to us, but our own desperate desire to defend ourselves at any cost. It is how quickly we will give up on relationships in order to nurture our own wounded pride. So the good news is we don't have to inhabit an ever-expanding hell by avoiding conflict. Jesus says we can go to the people who've hurt us and tell us what is wrong, or even better, what we think is wrong. Because the best way to end a fight is to admit that we have been wrong. We can ask ourselves if we really know about what happened, where we got our information. We can think about our own motives in confronting the other person, whether we're doing it more to hurt their feelings or to make the relationship whole again. We can ask what it is that we're afraid of. We can ask whether the relationship is worth it. And perhaps that last question is the most important one. Once you've decided that the relationship is what you want, you've taken the first step to realizing that the goal is not to win an argument, but to be reconciled. And at that point, it is time to set the lunch date, make the phone call, write the note that is the first step toward having your brother or sister back. Now, many of you know that I often give homework. Sometimes the homework is so easy, and today I have to tell you, it's very hard homework. And that is, I want, whether you're watching online or here in person, I want you to try to take that first step of reconciliation. I want you to try to build a new relationship. It's not easy to be part of a family. In many ways, it would be so much simpler if we were just a bunch of people here every Sunday having an individual experience of God in the same church building. But a private relationship with God is not what Jesus intends for us. Our life together, through thick and thin, is the primary way that God chooses to be with us. Not only to smooth out the rough edges of our characters, but because we need to be loved and cared for by other people. God saves us through each other, and how we choose to be reconciled with each other affects how we can be reconciled with God. The theologian Karl Barth writes that the one who loves is the one who has been touched by the freedom of God. This freedom, this joy, is what Jesus wants us to have. So we're called to confront, to persevere, and heal. to forgive and to be forgiven, to throw a party in the center of hell and fill it with such music and laughter, with such love and affection, that all of its residents come in from their distant retreats to see for themselves this joy that we share as a family.